I must confess this is the most moral presentation that I've given all weekend. I have a headache. I'm suffering. And I'm sacrificing. I don't really want to do this because NASCAR is on today in, I think, Michigan, and I'm missing the race. So I'm sacrificing seeing the race to be here, and I'm suffering at the same time. So this is the moment. I can't do this with a straight face. This is the, yeah, no, I really want to be here, so this is no sacrifice. I'm really good with this, right? Okay, so yeah, for those of you who don't know, I'm John Immel. I wrote a book. Now, this is actually not a qualification. I usually open my sessions with, I'm really no one from nowhere. And this isn't self-deprecation. This is just the truth. If you're looking for credentials and qualifications, I don't have them.
Nobody here does.
I'm not here to dazzle you with my accreditation. I'm here to lay out my best rational argument and to let you, as rational human beings, decide what you think of that. Now, if you're looking for somebody with authority to tell you what to think, well, go to your local Calvinist Reformed preacher and say, yea, verily, here's my brain. Tell me what I'm supposed to think, and I'm sure they'll accommodate you just fine. Okay, so what we have been talking about is the disaster of sacrifice as the highest moral ideal. And what we have seen over the course of the last few days in my sessions is that the oldest of all worldly ideas is that man is effectively a sacrificial animal. I really wish Christians would decide to abandon worldly ideas and live up to their own ideal, but they won't. The reason they won't is because it is endemic to their philosophical formulation. The primary shapers, intellectual shapers of modern Christianity, as we have seen, have its roots deep, deep, deep in Platonism, and the metastasized version of Platonism in Augustine, and then the further metastasization in Calvin. The secular iteration of that is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant put the final nails in the coffin of any self-interest at any point in any time, and he did it such that even secular people could arrive at the exact same conclusion. Now, this becomes very important in the modern age. I opened this whole session with talking about how America, we are facing a new dark age. And the reason that sacrifice is so central to tyranny is directly related to this observation right here. All people act logically from their assumptions. It does not matter how inconsistent the ideas or insane the rationale, they will act until the logic is fulfilled. Therefore, when you see masses of people taking the same destructive actions, find the assumptions, and you will find the cause. The primary assumption that is once again flooding the world is that man is a sacrificial animal, and the only option from there is death and destruction. Again, this is my spider chart, and this, remember I told you at the beginning, these are the 5 fundamental categories of tyranny. You will find all tyrannies use some variation of these arguments to produce tyranny, to produce, concentration camps, the Caliphate, and Puritan New England as examples. And this is why altruism is so central to tyranny. Notice how the branches of all of these sub-arguments are actually tied to altruism, man as sacrificial animal. For instance, under collective conformity, how many times you heard the preacher say, no man is an island? Yeah, right? Pretty much everybody raises their hand. The preacher says no man is an island, but what he really means is that no man in my church has the right to his own ideas. That's what he really means. Collective conformity. He is demanding you to abandon your own rational judgment. Dictated good. Top. We believe in servant leadership, the preacher says. But what he really means is, no man in my church has the right, wait, you know what? Wrong one. We believe in servant leadership, but the preacher really means my qualification for being in charge is telling you what to think. He believes that his judgment is the good. And it is his right to tell you what that good is. Universal guilt. You are proud. But what? You are arrogant. It's effectively, it's a flip side of the exact same coin. It actually makes no difference, and I'm going to expand this here in a second. You're proud, but what the preacher really means is you are morally corrupt. You are taking part in humanity's original sin. You are displaying Adam's heritage. Universal guilt. So by virtue of having any confidence, and here is what this does. Remember I told you at the very beginning, sacrifice, altruism corrupts the meaning of words. When what they're really saying to you is, you can have no confidence. You have no right to believe in your own abilities. And any manifestation of confidence is really a disqualifier. It's an ad hominem attack. It's an argument to the man. Since you are universally guilty, you can't get away from Adam's original sin, you have no right to be confident about anything. And you'll see in the future that this has a dramatic impact on marriage. Oh, I just realized I needed to say this disclaimer. For those of you watching on camera, in about 7 pages here of notes, I'm going to talk about things you probably don't want your 10-year-old kids hearing. I would have this conversation with my 15-year-old if I had one, but if you have young kids and you don't want to explain marriage things to young kids, you might want to usher them out of the room. I can't imagine there are 10-year-olds watching this, but I don't want to scandalize or shock, so you might want to hustle them out of the way. So that was my disclaimer. You have plenty of time to get there, but just know. Collective conformity. Back down here. You are rebellious. You're giggling. Are you laughing at me or laughing near me?
No, I was accused of that all the time.
Yeah. You're rebellious, says the preacher. But what he really means is, I have the moral right to dictate the content of your life. You have no moral right to resist my authority. Rebellion is an appeal to political power. Anytime somebody says you're rebellious, what they're really saying is you're defying my government right. And this is what the preacher actually believes. He is compelling you to collectively conform. The abolition of ambition. You're arrogant, the preacher says. But what he really means is, I don't like your confidence. You have no business being confident because you really have no ability. So you can begin to see how this altruism, self-sacrifice, man as a sacrificial animal, ties all of this together. And this is why this is so fantastically destructive. Here is, in broad terms, how collectivism cascades down to the smallest subset. Anytime you see somebody appealing to the greater good, the good of the people, what they're ultimately doing is appealing to the moral standard of altruism to ultimately drive individuals into one of these subsets. Collectivism, in the biggest terms, encompasses statism. In other words, you as a person, as an individual, your first moral requirement is to the state. The society, which is a subset of a state depending on common cultural expectations. The tribe, which is effectively, for heaven's sake, John, genetics into political code. Or the community. Now the community can be the denomination, the sect, or the local church Calvinist tyrant. And here's the problem. How can you resist any monstrosity if you must sacrifice your judgment that compels you into any of these things? And the answer is you can't. See, here's the question you need to ask for yourself. Under the premise of self-sacrifice, on what moral grounds can you resist government? Anybody want to take a whack? Give me a moral justification for resisting government if self-sacrifice is the highest moral standard. Anybody want to take a whack? And the answer is you have none. You have no moral right to resist. By what moral standard can you say I disagree? Now don't cheat. Don't pretend that you can disagree in your head and sacrifice saying it out loud. That just makes you a moral fraud. Dissension inside your head is still a claim to personal autonomy. But your own self-sacrificial standard, you have no moral right to intellectual autonomy. The only way you can claim intellectual independence is to hold rationality and independence as a primary value. So then, riddle me this. The political leader stands up and says, Muslims have the right to come to the United States, keep their ideology, and that ideology vows the destruction of America as such. How can you object? This is obviously a rhetorical question because the answer is you can't. To demand security is to be selfish. To demand your own self-interest is to be selfish and therefore morally disqualified. The only moral standard is to sacrifice your security and consequences be damned. As a committed altruist, you must destroy your values. You must destroy your goals, ambitions, contentment, and life. So you have no other choice but to stand idly by, mute in the face of all ideological monstrosity, and allow the invasion of your country. I told you, sacrifice is destroying America. Sacrifice is destroying a free society at its root. And this is why. Sacrifice corrupts government. When it is morally correct to demand sacrifice, it becomes socially correct to compel people to sacrifice. The Federal Register is filling up with laws that are aimed specifically at compelling people to sacrifice for the greater good. For example, Obamacare is not about health care. It has nothing to do with getting people to a doctor. Obamacare is little more than the government committing armed robbery in the name of morality. Obamacare is a systematic seizing of money from the healthy merely because they are healthy. And herein is the political trend in American politics. Here's where we are. Remember I told you, man's moral choice currently in the United States is masochism or sadism. As of right now, we have in the Federal Register dominant sadism. The government feels empowered, is morally empowered to compel you to do things against your own rational self-interest. And it is all based on the presumption that duty equals morality equals soul-crushing pain. At the moment, we are a nation stymied by the charge of selfishness. In the political sphere, the greatest criticism that anyone can render is that you're selfish. That is immediately disqualifying. It doesn't matter what you're advocating. It doesn't matter if it's a better policy, a better social policy. The moment somebody tags you with you're selfish, the discussion is over. Free people are being browbeat into accepting any treatment, any hostility, any destruction, and any exploitation, all in the name of self-sacrifice. Sacrifice is destroying America because sacrifice destroys the meaning of words. Okay, so listen to about any sportscast. I don't care which one. Actually, any newscast, it doesn't matter. But you really catch it in sports. And you will hear an announcer praise an athlete for his great unselfish play. I don't know how many times I've heard this applied to, say, like men like LeBron James. That because LeBron doesn't specifically score a point and gives a pass, he is being unselfish. Well, that is objectively ridiculous. LeBron James is probably, maybe next to Michael Jordan, one of the greatest players to ever play the game and one of the most prolific scorers, or at least amongst the top 3, top 5. When LeBron James avoids scoring a bucket, he is actually penalizing his team because statistically speaking, the ball will probably go through the hoop. It is not an unselfishness that's at issue there. It is actually a failure of conceptual understanding there. It is rationally correct for the best scorers to consistently try to score. So attributing a pass to unselfishness is a corruption of words. Athletes do not sacrifice for better athletic ability. Athletes invest. It is not a sacrifice to choose training over, say, going to a movie. That's an investment. Training to develop athletic talent versus going to a movie that does not develop that talent is an investment. It's an alternative of values, and we learned early on in this discussion that one of the central features of human existence is the alternatives available to us. We set our values and have alternatives, and we can choose alternatives that advance our objectives, advance our values, advance our life, or things that actually take us away from it. Now, there isn't something specifically morally wrong with going to a movie. What I'm saying is that professional athletes, even amateur athletes, make choices about what advances their individual life. And it is not a selfish action, and it certainly isn't a sacrifice to choose those paths. But sacrifice corrupts words. This whole concept is probably best understood in light of, say, like a farmer. A farmer is not sacrificing when he chooses to plant a seed instead of eating the seed for dinner. Planting a seed is an investment. Choosing to spend time improving athletics is just like planting seeds. When professionals choose training over any other course of action, they are making investments. They are exercising a rational, volitional choice to pursue specific values. But in our culture, everything has become an issue of sacrifice. Okay, so here's your homework. And this is actually kind of fun. I actually do this consistently. If I were a beer drinker, I'm not. But if I were a beer drinker, this would be a great beer drinking game. Every time you hear the word sacrifice on television or in a movie or in a news broadcast, take a drink of beer and you'll be out. You'll be stone cold drunk before the third hour is there. Start listening in our culture for how often people ascribe their actions to sacrifice. And please understand this. Every time you hear a mother say they sacrificed buying a pair of shoes for milk for the kids, that's not sacrifice. Anytime you hear a father that says he works to satisfy the needs of his family versus buying, say, video games, that's not sacrifice. Parents that say such things are not revealing their moral commitment. They are revealing their moral bankruptcy. I'm going to say that again because it's very important that you get this. Parents who say such things are not revealing their moral commitment. They are revealing their moral bankruptcy. They are revealing their irrationality. They are revealing that they have no values as such. The fact is that once you bring, say, children into the world, you have chosen a course that is committed for life. And those children are the primary values. Their life, right? The life is the standard. And so perpetuating and sustaining life is the standard. And so when a woman says, I've sacrificed because I bought milk instead of, say, buying a pair of shoes, is revealing that she flat does not understand the advancement of life as such. She is morally bankrupt, just like the man is who buys the video game and calls it a sacrifice. Okay, so that was free.
The economic term for that, by the way, is opportunity cost.
Opportunity cost. Right.
Which is not necessarily wrong.
Right.
But it's putting it into proper perspective.
And actually, you know what, Andy, that's actually a very good way to frame this. It is an opportunity cost. My life, by a series of succession of choices, I have opportunity costs throughout my life, but they're not sacrifices. I chose a different set of values. And any parent, anyone who places their personal opportunity costs, say, for buying shoes versus the opportunity, but the real value of their children, they're showing their moral bankruptcy. The issue is not whether they would sacrifice more, they're showing that they're morally vacant. So anyway, here's the game. Listen to how often individual actions are defined and defended as being sacrifices. Listen to how often we as a nation qualify our positions with, I don't get anything out of this. One of the reasons that I specifically, when I introduce my book, and I say I'm a capitalist, and I say buy it online for $23.95 or whatever it is, the specific reason I do that is because I do get something out of you buying it. And I fully expect to be compensated for you buying my intellectual property. I am unapologetic about being a capitalist because I believe that my ideas have fundamental value. And we are now exchanging value. There's no compulsion here. This is not on some pastoral reading list where you got to give them money just because they told you had to. I am specifically pointing out that I have a vested interest in you buying my book, and that is morally correct. Listen to how many times you hear the words give back. This is all based on the same fundamental expectation. That somehow your gain is a theft from those who had it. When in actual fact, they had no involvement in what you did. You had no moral right to give them anything back. In the event they entered into an exchange with you at all, they have already decided the value of that exchange. I don't have a moral obligation. You give me $23.99 on Amazon. I have no moral obligation to give you anything back because you decided that my book was worth that to you.
From an economic standpoint, it shows a failure to understand the idea of wealth.
Exactly right.
Their idea of wealth is that wealth is a limited commodity, that there is a pie, and that everybody gets a piece of the pie, and that somehow you are unfairly taking too much of that pie and not
Correct.
leaving enough pie for somebody else.
That's exactly right. That's an excellent point.
But in reality, wealth is not a fixed commodity. It grows via the means of production. So every time you write a word in a book, you are creating wealth because you are producing it, and that makes the pie bigger.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. By the way, I need to take a drink. I don't get anything out of this promotion. I really like Cascade Ice. That was so funny. Come on, guys.
I went out at 5 o'clock this morning and bought you some more of it.
That was very kind of you. I'm glad you sacrificed for me like that. See how crazy this gets? And in our non-beer drinking game, because we're with a bunch of teetotalers here, listen to how often the word sacrifice is said near the word community. This is the game you should play with yourself. And you will see within short periods of time how saturated our culture is with this fundamental premise. Sacrifice destroys achievement. Achievement is the product of individuals pursuing their own goals, persevering through obstacles, thinking through the flaws to overcome all challenges and finally arrive at a destination, outcome, or final product. Achievement is the long process of man pursuing values over time, making choices about alternatives in a particular succession until finally refined into the desired outcome. Note, this is why productivity and perseverance are virtues. This process I just described brought about the Wright brothers' first flight. Nikola Tesla's three-phase electric power, his induction motor, his alternating current, and many, many more achievements. It brought about Charles Kettering's electric starter motor, car lights, leaded gasoline, and advancements in air conditioning, among many achievements. And yet most people, if they know of these achievements at all, or these men at all, they trivialize the achievements because unless these men gave away their money, they cannot be moral. By contrast, people will venerate Mother Teresa for her vows of poverty, while dismissing the fact that her life of sacrificial giving is only possible because someone achieved air flight, induction motors, electric car starters, advancement in air conditioning, and many, many more achievements. Here's the thing, Mother Teresa can't feed anyone, ever, because Mother Teresa doesn't create anything. The farmer had to achieve growing a crop. The trucking company had to achieve getting food from the farm and finding someone to process the raw goods into consumable products. Shipping companies had to achieve creating ocean-traveling boats. 1,000 achievements from 1,000 people pursuing their own values had to occur before Mother Teresa could ever pat someone on the hand and give away food she never aspired to create. Yet her vows of poverty, her sacrifice, is held up as the moral ideal. She is venerated as a saint while she wouldn't even be worthy to untie Charles Kettering's shoelace. Now, we happen to be here in Ohio, and I don't know what it is about the Dayton area and the Ohio area in particular. Ohio gets a bad rap. But the amounts of invention, the amount of people who were inventors, who had their careers and their lives here, is stunning. Yeah. And Charles Kettering happens to be, every time you go out to your car, the reason you're not sitting there cranking it and risking breaking your arm is because Charles Kettering figured out how for you to turn a key and turn it on. If there was ever a man who helped people, it was Charles Kettering. And yet, most people, if they know of Charles Kettering, the only thing they know about him was his philanthropy. And here's the thing, in a world of achievement, where achievement is a virtue, the Mother Teresas of the world, the men and women who live off the abilities of others will be seen for what they are, freeloading slackers. And this is true of all Calvinist preachers living off the public dole. The only way they make a mortgage payment, or feed their kids, or even buy their first John Piper book, is because the people in the pews create real achievements 6 days of 7. Paul, do you have a comment?
Bill Gates sought to save his legacy by by basically giving away how much of his money, what was the foundation him and his wife started?
Actually, his goal now is to give away all of his money, which is almost impossible at this rate.
Right, because he caved into the idea that unless he did that, he's a schmuck.
He's a schmuck, yep. And you know what?
Basically, he didn't want to die, or he didn't want his legacy to be that of a schmuck. So he's giving away all his money.
And here's, since IT happens to be my vocation, I happen to be particularly keen on this particular issue. What Bill Gates achieved, no matter what you happen to think of his business practices, is nothing short of miraculous. In 30 years, he has created some of the most productive people on the planet ever in the history of the world. His software, his products, and what those products are able to do to solve thousands, millions upon millions upon millions of technical connections across the globe is an unparalleled achievement ever in the history of the world. The industry he single-handedly created out of nothing, but what he achieved. and the content of his technology is absolutely unparalleled. And yet, he is a man plagued by this fundamental premise that somehow his achievements and the achievements of Microsoft in general are somehow immoral. And so the only way he can redeem his life is to sacrifice and give it all away. And pretty much every apocalyptic movie you see now, without fail, there is this sustained technology. Well, here's the problem. The moment you banish achievement from human existence, there is no technology. We're back in the Stone Age in a heartbeat. Within generations, we will lose the knowledge that makes technology possible. And if you doubt me, look at what happens to a culture that is ravaged by ISIS. Basically, a Dark Ages ideology that does its best, level-headed best to destroy anything that basically doesn't come from Islam. And they reduce countries to ash in a heartbeat, directly related to the presumption that everything is sacrificed to Allah. There is no technological achievement. There's no achievement as such under the concepts of altruism.
Right.
And so you must have individuality as your primary premise of any kind of technological advance. There is no such thing. The moment we actually drop into the Dark Ages intellectually, your grandchildren, their grandchildren, whenever it actually hits, they'll be living in a half an inch from the Stone Age in a blink.
Well, China had several revolutions where they executed all of the
Intellectuals. And it's taken them almost, 60 years to dig out of that pit? The Great Revolution was the 1950s.
After taking shortcuts and stealing technology from us, yeah.
Well, they couldn't sustain it. That was the thing. They had to steal it because they couldn't create it, and then they realized they couldn't sustain it.
Right.
And so what they had to do is actually open up economic zones, which is basically capitalism unleashed in Shanghai and Hong Kong, and those are the areas that are fueling effectively the rest of the backwards third world country that is China.
Right.
Anyway, I got to move on because that stuff really winds me up. So here's the thing with you people still attending those Calvinist churches out there. If you ever actually figure out that the men behind the plexiglass podium have no right to your money, most of the preachers will starve to death because they won't qualify for a job at McDonald's. You can't run a McDonald's chanting, submit to authority, submit to authority, submit to authority. And that's the sum of their managerial skill. And I will say this, it is an achievement in an achievement-based society. The C.J. Mahaneys and the Brent Detweilers of the world, the former SG Sovereign Grace Ministry homeboys, would do a lot less damage if they were limited to saying, would you like to make that a meal?
Yeah.
And now you...
McDonald's, may I have your submission, please?
What did you say? That was good. Welcome to McDonald's. May I have your submission, please? That was good. That was really good. I wish I'd have thought of that one. Now you can understand why sacrifice is so destructive. If man must sacrifice the sum of who he is never morally justified to achieve any individual goal. The only available option is to sit and do nothing. And the man who sits and does nothing is dead. Sitting still is death. And here's the thing, and this is, if you stop and look at reality for more than 10 minutes, you can see this in action. Men are built to work. We're built to achieve.
Yeah.
Men specifically, and I don't mean to preclude the women here, but men specifically are built to work. The most miserable men on the planet are the ones who do nothing with their lives. The ones who are sitting still playing video games, or sitting still not playing video games, they're miserable human beings. Find a miserable man, and I guarantee he is sitting doing nothing. He has no ambition. He has no drive. His life is drudgery. Men, how often do we watch men who retire and die very shortly after? man as such, man metaphysically is a value-driven, goal-driven, achievement-driven being. As an aside, I want you to notice, and I don't have time to exegete this whole thing, but God gave Adam 3 jobs. He defaulted on 2 of them. Go out into the world and rule and subdue it. That was the charge. Go out into the world and rule and subdue the world. And Adam never got his butt out of the garden. He didn't get out of the garden, and what led him to go look for knowledge someplace else was because he didn't go do what God told him to do. Adam was indolent. He was like the average 16-year-old who just wouldn't go do the job that his father gave him. Fundamentally, Adam undercut his own life because he wouldn't go achieve. Rob man of his achievement part of his nature, and he will surely die. Now, note, this is why productivity and integrity are virtues. Sacrifice destroys marriages. Sacrifice gives Calvinist thugs the moral power to perpetrate their tyranny. I want to talk about these two together because they go hand in hand. Most people first encounter Calvinist thuggery in the middle of a marriage problem. You go to the pastor for help in your marriage, and within 3 counseling sessions, you find yourself embroiled in a fight for your life. Okay. Let me expand on this a minute. You have serious problems in your marriage, and you go to the pastor in an effort to try to get some help. You get to the pastor, and the next thing you realize is that you're proud, you're arrogant, and you're not sacrificing. That is almost universally their response. And here's the problem. You look in the mirror, and you're like, really? I mean, are these things really not right for me? I mean, how many more things can I kill? How many more sacrifices can I make? And not least of which, they probably don't know you. Most of the time, the Calvinist preachers don't come out of their ivory towers, and so socially they don't know you. And so the presumption behind their accusations is always flabbergasting, because you're like, you don't know me. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I've done or where I've been. And yet they are fantastically dismissive of your existence and feel morally justified to be that way. And then you make the mistake of assuming that your opinion matters on the subject. And the more you decide to defend yourself, the more they are convinced that their observations are exactly correct. And it is a vicious cycle, because you try, and then, okay, so they crack open the Bible and they start showing you passages, and then you crack open the Bible and read back. And then you realize, well, wait a minute, you never understand that you can't out-authority the authority. Because the moment you start trading Bible verses, really what you're debating is who has the authority to compel the other person to believe what they think. That's it. You can never get away from this. And this is why talking to a Calvinist thug never works. And why it is ultimately no success in fixing the problems. Now, here is the central problem, is your marriage was probably broken long before you got into the pastor's office. What has happened is that those failures have run their course. So, this is the part that I told you not to have kids around for. Why do most Christians get married? The unromantic answer is sex. Usually it starts young, somewhere in your 20s, particularly for men. They can't help themselves. They want sex a lot. And so they finally find a girl who's willing to have sex with them. And then they have a real problem because they want to be moral. They don't want to do bad things. And so they rush to get married. And I think women probably get sucked into this more than anything else. They think they've got a Christian guy because they'll go to church with him. And most of the time, the reason they want a Christian guy is because they don't want a guy who'll sleep around on them. And so they assume, at the root, that if the guy goes to church, he won't have sex with lots of other people. That's the moral presumption. And if problems do happen, the only consistent value they share is that they'll sacrifice the bad things out of their marriage. Well, once the sex part begins to ebb and flow, once we actually get past it, what people finally figure out is that sex drive and libido is very directly tied to your own sense of self and personal values. Well, the problem is you've been going to a church now for however long that tells you you can have no value. So it's a death spiral from the outset. So here's what the ideal would look like. You look in the mirror, and these are the things that you really value about who you are. Now, it doesn't matter what they are. I have my own set of things that I really value. You would have the things that you really value. And you say to yourself, these are my highest values and aspirations. And then when you come to another person and you see those values reflected back in your face, it's almost impossible to resist the attraction because you see yourself reflected back. And you know as well as I do that the greatest relationships you have ever observed is because the number of values the one person has, they see them almost all reflected back. Now, there might be some subtle negotiation on the expressions, but at the end of the day, there's almost a mirror image. But here's the problem. You came to the marriage relationship in Christianity believing that sacrifice was the highest ideal, and you end up with something that looks like this. You have effectively no relationship here. You have a fundamental problem. The thing you've basically shared was some libido. But at the end of the day, your real values, if you've identified them at all, you got nothing in common. And then you've been now sitting in the pew for who knows how long, and it's now an endless negotiation on who has sacrificed the most. Now here's the problem. Here's what this ends up looking like. The wife says, "You're selfish, you work all the time." And the man says, "What are you talking about? I sacrifice all the time. I work 1 billion hours a week trying to make sure you got enough money to spend it on shoes. If you quit buying all those shoes, I could work less." And here's the thing, the wife doesn't care about the shoes. She's buying shoes because it's the one thing that kind of gives her some solace in her loneliness. What she wanted was the guy home. And so here's the problem with sacrifice in a personal relationship. What you're sacrificing is an individual value. The other person doesn't care whether you cut it off or not. They have no skin in that game. So you've spent all this time, click, 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 shutting down. Till eventually, you got nothing. And this is, of course, why so many marriages get 20 years into it. And finally, one of the partners says, "You know what? I'm dead. I got nothing else. I got nothing to give you. I am done." The social emotional pain, the internal emotional pain is so great that they really are dying. And this is where midlife crises come from. You have really done exactly what you've been taught. You have been sacrificing. Fundamentally, at the root, you have been killing yourself. Now here's the thing. Because of Kant and Calvin, pain has been elevated to a moral primary. But here's the real reality. Pain is a signal that something is profoundly wrong. Pain is your signal that something is the problem, and the goal is to get rid of the pain, not because you are in a mad dash for pleasure as such, but because pain is the signal that it's time to fix something internally. Now, what ends up happening now is you hit 40-something, 50-something, and you're like, I got nothing else to give you. I really honestly spent the last however many years killing myself in an effort to try to sustain this relationship. There's nothing else to give. So the classic stereotype is the 50-year-old man who at work finds the secretary or finds some cute thing that he's working with, and he ends up divorcing the first wife and ends up with the second woman. And here's why. That woman looked at him and he saw his value reflected back in his face. She didn't have all that relational baggage. She wasn't living in that world of sacrifice. She was in the world of achievement. She's at work. He's achieving. He's the best expression of himself. She looks at this man and sees value. And it's refreshing because he sees her look at him and it starts to look like this. And one day he says to himself, "You know what? That's what I really want. Now, it doesn't matter ultimately if he ends up picking poorly or picking wrong. At the end of the day, the root of this issue is that both parties in the marriage have been living their life according to sacrifice on values they really do not share. And they've been systematically destroying themselves in service to trying to sustain a relationship. Now here's why I would probably have this conversation with my 15-year-old kid if I had one. Long before you get to who you have sex with, you must first figure out what your virtues are. Because what sustains sexual attraction are virtues. When you look at the other person and you see them as virtuous, when you see them as rational people, as honest people, as people of justice, as people of rational independence, people of integrity, and people of productivity, it becomes very easy to pick who you want with you in your life. And your greatest, most long-standing relationships, whether you have sex with them or not, are all based on the fact that you will see your values reflected back to you. And that's what you're looking for. Libido, particularly when you're young, hard to overcome. It's easy to make mistakes, and because sex is interesting. Orgasms are nice, right? But you can't sustain it. The older you get, the more you realize that your sexual attraction genuinely follows your values. And the more express you are in understanding your personal values, it becomes trivially simple to see who you'd actually like to be with. Because the moment you figure out they're really crazy, male or female, you don't want to have sex with that. You don't want to be a part of that. You hold your own integrity and your own value too high. So at the root of this is an absolute sense of the moral right of your own existence. And this is what you can never have in a Calvinist church. And this is why Calvinism destroys marriages. Because it undermines at the root the very people that are involved in the marriage. So now let's wrap up the tail end of your conversation, your initial conversation with the pastor about trying to save your marriage. It's doomed from the outset from this interaction because the roots of the interaction are flawed catastrophically. Now, the problem you have now is that you've got yourself in a position where doctrinally you believe you're not supposed to get divorced. You're going to have to wrestle that within your own heart and in your own mind. I will say this. At the tail end of yesterday, Paul kind of walked into this concept. And I've been thinking about it since he said it, and this is not a full doctrinal evaluation. But I thought it was a really good argument. Calvinist preachers insist that it is their authoritative right to consecrate a marriage. It is their authoritative right to determine your good standing within the church. In other words, the nature of your ongoing progressive sanctification. And so if you end up in the middle of a pastoral fight where they disfellowship you, or whatever words they want to attach to it, and they kick one spouse or the other out based on their authority, then in my mind, they have preempted the issue of divorce. They can't have it both ways. They can't say they have all this authority as a pretense and then decide that that authority doesn't specifically apply in one instance. That's actually a pretty good argument. Now, it's a doctrinal problem that they have created. So, wrangle it out with them. But I actually do think that's a pretty good thing, pretty good argument. Now, as for friends, and this is actually something I think that really trips people up. You've been going to this church for who knows how long. You've known some of these people for decades, maybe. Suddenly, you're in the middle of what you consider to be a fight for your life, and you go to your friends. And suddenly you realize you don't have any friends. And this is salt on really open wounds.
Yeah.
Because you're confused. You really honestly believed that these people had your back. Mm-hmm. And suddenly you realize, no, they don't.
Right.
They do not have your back. They would sell you out in a minute for pastoral approval. And that actually leaves you high and dry, because now you're looking at the world and it's a dark, cold place, and you've just spent however many years being told that the only honest, real, genuine expression you have is because all these other people say, yea, verily, I like you. And now no one says that. And so now you're stuck, because you have so atrophied your own sense of self, your own sense of achievement. You honestly can't project into the future your own existence. And that is probably one of the loneliest, hardest places to be in the world. But I'm going to tell you the truth. You have no one to blame but yourself. You let somebody tell you that your existence was contingent on the approval of other people. Now, when you're 15, that sounds like that's a reasonable problem. When you're 40, no, that's your fault. It's your problem. And I will say this, men, women, particularly men, if you're begging a woman to come back to you, if you won't talk back to the pastors because you're very sure that if you talk back to the pastors that the woman will somehow decide you're really not interested in having her, you need to grow a pair of balls. First of all, if you have to beg a woman to be with you, you've got bigger problems than whether she needs somebody else's approval. But if she genuinely needs the approval of other men to come back to you, she's not worth your time. Think of that a minute. She needs the approval of other men to come back to you to have sex with you. Are you joking? Are you serious? You want to cater to that? Yeah, you deserve what you get if you keep after that.
Well, this is something that's happening. It's epidemic in the Protestant church.
And that's actually why I'm hammering on this one. Because I think this is, what I said is true. You need to grow a pair. And women, if your husband genuinely needs authority as an aphrodisiac, he is not worthy to be bedded for anything. Walk away. Find a man who actually has something to offer. Find a man of achievement. Find a man of real virtues, perseverance, somebody who actually wants to do something with his life. That's the man worthy of having in your life and in your bed. Anybody else, he's a little boy who has no business doing any such thing. I'm going to actually read some self-plagiarism here. Blight in the Vineyard, chapter Interpersonal Train Wreck. Now pause and digest the system dynamic I just laid out in detail and take inventory of the cause and effect of your emotional upheaval. This is why you feel so utterly betrayed and so deeply wounded. This is why you ache with despair that will not go away. You offered the sum of self, and people presumed the moral right to accept or reject the deepest parts of you and call their actions spiritual. They spent your relationship like dollar bills in the pastoral G-string on a private authority lap dance. No one can sustain this kind of utter personal rejection. No one can sustain others using unearned intimacy to fill out their Christian authenticity balance sheet. So when you rightly complained about the mistreatment, they were brazen in defense. Forgive me if I sinned against you, but since I am the authority in this interaction, I can say this conflict really exists because you are the problem. Sacrifice is the fulcrum of this control. Here's the real meaning of the doctrine of self-sacrifice. You're not entitled to your mind. You're not entitled to your ideas. You're not entitled to your own aspirations, goals, desires, values, or orgasms. If self-sacrifice is your moral standard, how can you object to any idea? The fact is, you have forfeited your right to any personal opinion. You have no moral right to resist the preacher, no matter how atrocious, how grotesque his demands. Forget the pastoral fictional monopoly on sound doctrine. Forget that they have no authority to dictate any outcome. The moment someone committed to Reformed theology says the word, "I think," they are disqualified. Your impotence does not come from their authority. Your impotence comes from the fact that you don't value your own existence. If you don't think it is morally correct to defend you, why on earth would anyone else defend you? And this is why most of you have a terrible time escaping the church that is destroying your soul. As an aside, I think it's probably appropriate that I explain to you how to get out of a New Calvinist church. You ready? Walk out the door.
Been there, done that.
And most of you listening to my voice, if you're not already scandalized, you're like, how? Here's the very little secret. You don't owe them an explanation. Don't write a letter. Don't say fairly well. Walk out the door. And the reality is they will have no idea how to deal with that. They will fuss and moan and complain and wring their hands and talk of your great wayward soul and all that rot. When you finally walk away, unapologetically, without explanation, I remember those days, and they had no idea how to deal with that. With the exception of just running me out on a rail. Making sure I was because here's the thing, one of the things you got to understand, men who are actually committed to authority as such, the one thing they can never tolerate is the appearance of any dissension. They can't tolerate it. And so the only thing they can do is to make every effort to segregate you from everything else. They have no ability to deal with that. And don't try to save people. It's not your job. It's not your job to go back and reform that church. It's not your job.
No.
And that is
saving the church.
If there is any conceit in this process, I'm all for individuality. I'm all for independent thinking. But if there's any individual conceit in this whole process, is somehow believing that God has appointed you to save that church. That's stupid.
Wow.
Get out,
That's
stay out. That is a fantastic arrogance. The fact of the matter is, you can't out-authority the authorities. It doesn't happen. You can make a fantastic argument, and all they got to do is go, well, you know, my Bible, I'm the authority here. My Bible doesn't say that. Alakazam poof. Get out and stay out. Walk away. They won't have the slightest idea what to do with it. Your significant other, whatever, she won't have any. It just, look, trust me. Everything I just said, I understand where the compulsion comes to try to fix it. It doesn't work. It will never work. Walk out the door. Walk out the door, shake the dust off your feet, and leave it alone. That is the fastest path on the planet to getting healthy. So, John, how can I save my marriage? If only my husband or wife would sacrifice everything, we all would be right with the world. Wrong. Sacrifice is what's destroying your marriage. I don't know how many times I've had some variation of this conversation over the last 30 some odd years. And almost always the first question I lead with after the person gets done explaining their pain and their torment, the first thing I ask them is, okay, so what was the original attraction? And it's a very revealing question. And because with some primary consistency, they can't actually think what that original attraction was. And the unflattering thing is that for the most part it was we wanted to have sex and we wanted to be okay with God, usually. And sometimes it's so long ago and there is so much hurt and pain heaped on top of it, it's almost impossible to uncover what was good. Well, therein lies part of the problem. But the fix is, if you really want to fix and you actually have a partner that isn't getting their cues from some other men, trust me, if that's the case, get rid of them fast. They're not worth your time. But here are the virtues: rationality, honesty, justice, independence and integrity, and productivity. Go back first and identify those in yourself. Get a very solid understanding of what that means to yourself. I don't know how many men I found in their 50s that suddenly find themselves out on their own trying to reinvent their own life. And the reason they're reinventing it is because they spent so much time killing it. It's not uncommon to get to your 50s and go, who the hell am I? And the reason you don't know is because you've been trying to kill that person. So now you have a mission, a singular mission. Try to figure out who you are. What do you value? And here is the real challenge. For many of you, your self-motivation, your own initiative, and your own sense of productivity has been so atrophied that you will find it almost impossible to do it. One of the reasons in Blight in the Vineyard I spend so much time on self-initiated action, just starting with the basics, is because of this fact. Go out and buy yourself, if you want it, go out and buy yourself ice cream. And you would be stunned at how many people just struggle with that because for whatever reason in the annals of their church experience, a self-interest in wanting to buy ice cream or wanting to buy any triviality is a catastrophic spiritual failing. And so they're scared. Well, if I buy it, is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? And this is why the onion of self is so hard to combat when sacrifice is the fundamental principle. You can always find self in there somewhere, which means you can always find a reason why you're morally disqualified, which is why what John Calvin taught is so masterful in its manipulation. The first thing you have to do is to begin to identify the elements of you. Now, maybe you've got some things in there that are not really good ideas. Maybe in the grand scheme of values, they do not promote and perpetuate your life. You know what? It becomes very simple to get rid of those things once you identify the things that do advance and promote your life, that do advance rationality, honesty, justice, independence, integrity, and productivity. You mentioned, Wayne, is that him? Here's the thing, and now I'm going to address this specifically because Susan's been talking about this, rationality. Rationality in the relationship to alcoholism and drug use. At its root, alcoholism, not the consumption of alcohol. I don't care if you drink a beer or not. I care that your goal is drunkenness. I care that your goal is the obliteration of your mind. Drug use. I care that your goal is the obliteration of your mind. Rationality is the commitment to reality. When you're using drugs, you're specifically making an effort to blot out reality. Rationality cannot be a virtue if your goal is to live your life in a haze. Which means you are morally bankrupt. And watching someone commit slow suicide by this irrational act of ongoing consumption of alcohol and drugs is not a virtue. It is impossible to honor someone who is not honorable. Now, love is the emotional reaction to values. You cannot love something you don't value. It's not possible. And so quit trying to pretend that you have to look past these catastrophic failings of virtue. If you have a significant other that is committed to irrationality by the consumption, the ongoing determination to obliterate their mind with alcohol and drugs, they are not worthy of your respect. And it's crucial that you understand this. These are profound values, and if you value your own rationality, your own connection to reality, you have no business sanctioning that in someone else who does not. Yes, sir.
What about that in comparison to replacing your own mind with somebody else's reality?
Actually, Paul, that is a fantastic equation, and that is exactly right. It is exactly the same commitment. When you have basically are put in a position, somebody else has taken their brain and handed it to a pastor, and you are in the position to have to continue to sanction that relationship, that is morally wrong. You have no moral obligation to do any such thing. So now here you are in the process of reinvention. Now if you have two people committed to this same process, I will bet money that you will save the marriage. Because you will find that slowly but surely things start to emerge. Things that you have in common. Marriages that are doomed to fail, how many times have we watched this over the course of somebody's life? Their marriage is on the rocks almost from the beginning, but they end up with kids. And so they start sacrificing for the kids and they keep going. Now eventually they get 20 years into it, the last kid goes out the door, and suddenly they're looking at each other and they're going, who the hell are you? All right? Now here's the thing. Raising kids is its own brand of achievement. It requires the virtues that I've just been talking about here. It requires productivity. It requires integrity. It requires independence. It requires justice. How many times you got to solve problems within the family, right? All these things are virtues. And so it has the counterfeit ability to sustain a relationship that ultimately has no commonality. And so now you're confronted, the kids are out the door, and you don't have anything in common. Being able to save that is almost impossible. You can continue to lie to yourself about what you have in common, but at the end of the day, not so much. So, on that happy thought, let's talk about how to escape the coming dark age. It is often said that men will not sacrifice, but as we have seen, sacrifice as the highest moral standard is in human history. It is endemic to human history. It is inescapable in human history. We have seen consistently that men will sacrifice endlessly. We have seen that men will suffer enormous pains in the name of sacrifice. In National Socialist Germany, the German people sacrificed their minds, their time, their production, and their existence to the state. Indeed, the problem of human existence is not the willingness to sacrifice. History proves over and over and over that men will abundantly sacrifice. What men will not do is stand against the moral monstrosity of sacrifice. I'm going to read that again because that is really good. What men will not do is stand against the moral monstrosity of sacrifice. Hannah Arendt, maybe it's Arendt, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. After World War II, she dug into the roots of tyranny and totalitarian regimes. She wrote a lot about the subject, and here is what she said. In her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil, 1963. And just as the law in civilized countries assumes the voice of conscience tells everyone, thou shalt not kill, even though man's natural desires and inclinations may at times be murderous, so the law of Hitler's land demanded the voice of conscience tell everybody, thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt kill. Although the organizers of the massacres knew full well that murder is against the moral desires and inclinations of most people. Evil in the Third Reich had lost the quality by which most people recognize it, the quality of temptation. Many Germans and many Nazis, probably an overwhelming majority of them, must have been tempted not to murder, not to rob, not to let their neighbors go off to their doom. For that the Jews were transported to their doom, they knew, of course, even though many of them may not have known the gruesome details. And not to become accomplices in these crimes by benefiting from them. But, God knows, they had learned to resist temptation. And this is exactly what we see playing out in the church. Church leaders perpetrating all manner of evil, and the congregation standing idly by, resisting the temptation to object. And what the church does in their buildings is a harbinger of what is to come in American culture. Christians like the idea that America is a Christian nation, that it is a That's a problem, because historically Christian nations have let the blood flow deep and thick in the name of sacrifice. There has always been an uneasy relationship between the church and the Constitution. Christians love to claim the Constitution when it serves the purpose of religious freedom, but they reject the root constitutional premise. The Constitution presumes that man is an end in himself. Man is the sole purpose of government is to defend the individual in pursuit of his life, his liberty, and his happiness. The American Constitution has an implied moral standard that individual men are entitled to their own life. Individual men dispose of their lives for their own sake and for their own pleasures. But dare to suggest that man is an end in himself, and church people will start chanting sacrifice, 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 with all the fervor of a thuggy cult just before the high priest strangles the latest offering to Kali. Gospel according to John Immel, chapter 7:17. Sacrifice as the highest moral ideal is the linchpin of the coming dark ages. America was, past tense, no longer, the freest, most prosperous, happiest nation in the world because it led the world in individualism. America stands at a precipice. Behind us is the excellent history of liberty, individualism, freedom, values, success, and prosperity. The cliff in front of us falls off into the abyss of sacrifice and injustice and bloodshed and destruction. Americans are now turning their liberty and freedoms over to the primordial disaster of sacrifice. This does not bode well. Every nation that has walked this path has willingly walked in lockstep behind the dictator into mass destruction. America, if you want to escape the coming dark age, be the first people in history to find the courage to resist the temptation of sacrifice. Thank you.